Death of Brittany Murphy. December 20th, 2009, 8 a.m. The Los Angeles Fire Department would respond to a request for medical help at a residence home that would soon make headline news. Upon arriving, they were met by two people who quickly ushered them in and back to the bathroom, where a woman was found collapsed on the floor. The firefighters immediately began trying to resuscitate this young lady, but to no avail, so she was hastily transported to a nearby hospital, where she was pronounced dead at 10:05 a.m. due to going into cardiac arrest. This woman's name was Brittany Murphy, the actress who was involved in several prominent roles, such as Ty Frazier on the hit film Clueless, and of course, her voice acting as Luann Platter on King of the Hill. Safe to say, this was big news, and the public was obsessed with the case. What could have happened to this beloved 32-year-old who seemed to be in good health? Well, this is one of the most controversial and confusing mysteries in Hollywood history, with multiple theories over the years. But let's go to the autopsy first, which was performed the day after her death. The LA County coroner found that her death was due to pneumonia with secondary factors like severe iron deficiency anemia and multiple drug intoxication, as she had apparently been taking an assortment of over-the-counter and prescription drugs meant to treat a cold or respiratory infection. One of these drugs was the narcotic hydrocodone, and these elevated levels of these medications, taken in her weakened state, could have played a role. However, Brittany's mother, Sharon, and her husband, Simon Monjack, would dispute the claim that these medicines, or any drugs, played a role in her death. Instead, they cited a heart condition, mitral valve prolapse, a condition where the valve does not close properly and allows blood to flow back into the left atrium. However, doctors were quick to point out that that condition usually doesn't even require treatment and is rarely life-threatening. They stated she could have lived a very normal, healthy life with it, and they also pointed to the flu-like symptoms she had days leading up to her death, especially laryngitis, which seemed to get worse by the day. Now, it's important to point out here that Brittany's mother, Sharon, actually lived with the couple, as she had battled breast cancer twice, leaving Brittany to try and care for her. And after Brittany's death, Sharon continued to live with Simon, and it would only be about 6 months later, on May 23rd, 2010, he would pass away too. At 40 years old, he was found unresponsive in the same residence, and the coroner's report would state that he had died from acute pneumonia and severe anemia. By this time, the LA Department of Health began to suspect something was wrong with the house, and they speculated that there was a toxic mold present that was a factor. However, the coroner countered this claim and stated mold did not play a role, since there was none found in their lungs. Sharon, for what it's worth, called the mold theory absurd, at least at first, but her opinion began to change, and she would eventually state months later that mold had indeed killed Brittany and her son-in-law. But the public, that began to find Sharon and Simon's close relationship after Brittany's death is a little bit odd. There was that Larry King episode they appeared on where many people suggested that the two came off more as a couple than a grieving husband and mother, as the two would often reach for each other's hands. But this could just be two people grieving, right? Well, they also, for some strange reason, took several pictures together, holding each other in their embrace, which was certainly a little bit odd. It only got worse when Brittany's father, Angelo Bertolotti, began stirring the pot by claiming that Brittany was poisoned by someone in that home, although it should be pointed out, he was never in Brittany's life to begin with, and he was tied to organized crime, and was probably just trying to figure out a way to make some money. In fact, he paid for an independent toxicology report, which suggested she had been poisoned, citing heavy metals had been found in her hair. Of course, this was dismissed by the coroner and other experts who pointed out that the metal came from hair treatments. However, it is worth noting that several of Simon's colleagues and his so-called friends claimed he was directly responsible for Brittany's physical changes, like the significant amount of weight that she had lost, which left some worried for her, or the fact that he cut her off from all of her family except her mother. There were other things too, like his ex-fiancée, who said he was a disturbed individual that scammed people, with Brittany being his last victim. She even claimed that Simon had told her he suffered from spinal cancer, only to find out later on from his own mother that he didn't have cancer at all. Then there was another instance where he was at a public dinner with filmmaker Allison Burnett, and he proudly announced to the assembled crowd that he had dated women such as Ellie McPherson and Madonna, and he owned a collection of Ferraris, but ultimately he was dying of brain cancer, which, of course, was false. But having said all that, the most likely theory that most people believe today is she just died from pneumonia, and if she had just sought medical care, her death could have easily been prevented. Instead, she tried to treat it at home, and maybe her mom and son-in-law never realized how bad it was, and they just didn't take her to a hospital. Brittany did have at least one doctor's appointment scheduled in the days leading up to her death, and she canceled. It's also most likely that the medicine she was taking produced adverse effects on her already weakened body. Moon madness of Charles Hyde. How does the moon affect our behaviors? You have probably heard many accounts of this over time, which suggest that a full moon increases crime rates, violence, and aggression, or other things like automobile accidents increase, among other various strange statistics. Yet, this has been studied for decades, and it just doesn't hold true. In fact, 10 separate studies have tracked crime rates during a full moon, and in 8 of those, there was no difference in the crime statistics that night. Likewise, 7 studies were conducted on full moons and automobile accidents, and there was 0 correlation showed in that one. Yet the belief that the moon has such an effect on our mind still holds strong to this day. It's even how we got the word lunatic, which came from the belief that staring at a full moon would make you go crazy. And although the whole thing has been debunked, there is at least one case where it still holds true, and it involves a man named Charles Hyde, who was arrested in 1953 in London, England for breaking and entering, where he then stole wine, spirits, and clothing. When he went to trial, his lawyer pointed out that Charles had always been a good husband and father and all-around good person, until there was a full moon, and he would suffer what he called moon madness. He just went off the rails and would do things not typical of his character. His wife would also take the stand and mention Charles had a good reputation at his job, where he was a building contractor, and how great he had treated the family over the decade that they had been married. She also confirmed that he would get what she called moon trouble, and would act very strangely for the following week after a full moon. Once the effect wore off, Charles never even remembered the events. The detective investigating this, however, did point out that Charles had served a prison sentence on 9 different occasions for similar offenses. For whatever reason, though, the Crown bought it, and they put Charles on probation, and it was just a year later, after another full moon, that Charles broke that probation by leaving the country to go to Paris, where he joined the Foreign Legion and was sent to Algeria, where he participated in marches in the desert, 1,200 miles away from his home. At some point, he was discharged on medical grounds and made it back to London 6 weeks later. The authorities then found out about it, and he was arrested again for breaking his probation. But in looking back at the time period of when Hyde had left, it showed that a full moon had came out just 3 days before he had vanished, and crazily enough, they extended his probation again due to his moon madness. The story came to prominence in a Reader's Digest issue from 1983, although they incorrectly cited Hyde as the inspiration for the story of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was written about 70 years before the events of our Charles Hyde. And before we get to our mystery, let's talk about the confusion around Charles Hyde, the real criminal. Because not only did Reader's Digest cite that he was the inspiration for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they also cited he had used the moon madness defense successfully to get out of several charges of murder in the 1880s, which would be hard to do considering his charges for breaking and entering came in the 1950s. They probably reprinted this mistake though, after finding those same articles in the old tabloids from decades prior. It's been a long-running urban legend that Hyde was a serial killer in the 1880s that got away with all of it from using this flimsy excuse of moon madness. Even several skeptic articles cite that this really occurred, but it's all due to these tabloids and confusion over the sources. Charles Hyde did exist. There's even one source noting his prison escape some years prior to this whole moon madness defense in the 1950s. Having said all of that, did he really suffer some kind of moon-related mental illness? Unsurprisingly, like we discussed at the beginning, the moon's effect on the mind is said to be pseudoscientific, with no real data backing it, and more than likely, Hyde and his lawyer both knew that, but used it as a defense anyway. In fact, his attorney was a man named W.G. Scown, a well-respected lawyer of his time, and it's possible that fact would help sway the judge. It's also possible the Hyde's family left out some important facts, like Hyde was on drugs, or he was just an alcoholic, which would account for his times of his so-called blackouts. Even the lawyer may have used moon madness as a more colorful word for alcoholism. Finally, Hyde may have just had mental health issues at a time when they weren't greatly understood. The Linguin. In February of 1869, a man named Baron Alphonse Pereira was sitting in his canoe at the mouth of the Batavia River, located in Java, Indonesia, and he could have never been prepared for what he was about to see. Alphonse was actually the Austro-Hungarian consul general in Tunis, but he was visiting a government official stationed in the Dutch East Indies, a Mr. Metman, and Metman was a well-known sportsman, so he had decided to take Alphonse down the river on a big Java canoe, which was being paddled by some of the local Malay men. It was going up against this stiff morning breeze that the crew began to alert, "Linguin, Linguin." One of these men would go grab Alphonse and point towards the muddy shores about 500 feet away, and Alphonse couldn't believe what he was looking at. There was a large, long dark creature lying in the mud. He quickly grabbed his rifle, in spite of the fact that he didn't know what a Linguin was, although he suspected crocodile. He took aim, but the canoe was not steady enough for him to actually aim, only made worse by the fact that the frantic crew kept yelling, "Linguin, Linguin, shoot it, shoot it." Finally, Alphonse took a chance and fired. Then he saw a tremendous commotion in the mud, and this huge creature began whirling around as if it had been hit, much to the crew's happiness. The man steering the canoe then grabbed a scimitar, jumped overboard, and made his way to the now disabled creature. He would swim to shore and got in the mud, which was up to his knees. By this point, Alphonse was seeing the animal better, and he described it as having the body of a crocodile, while the neck and head was a snake. The beast, still wounded, tried its hardest to bite into the man now standing near him, but every time it leapt out, the man struck it with a scimitar, finally crushing down on it and striking the snake crocodile beast dead. The man then got back in the water and with great difficulty towed it through the water back to the canoe. After another difficult struggle, the beast was pulled up onto the canoe. It was so heavy that it almost pushed the side of the boat down into the water. Alphonse would begin to study it, since he had never seen a creature like it before. It was about 9.5 feet long, but what really struck Alphonse was all of the sword wounds revealed a white flesh of a fish. Not only that, there was no blood flowing from any of the wounds. Because this was an undocumented animal, at least according to Alphonse, he ordered that it be brought back to study. So the men carried it around until the midday hours, but it started to decompose pretty quickly, and they were left with no choice but to leave it behind. This was made easier by the fact that Mr. Metman promised Alphonse that there were plenty of Linguin around, and he would have a chance at nabbing another one. Yet, in all of his time in Java, he never seen another. So, what was this cryptid? Today, the most often speculated theory is large monitor lizard. The Asian water monitor lives throughout Southeast Asia. There's been many sightings of some that are over 6.5 feet long, and you even get the occasional 9.5 feet sighting. They have long necks and a crocodile-like body, and the name Linguin was probably just a local nickname, although Haggard emphasized that this animal had a very snake-like head, so it might not have been. Another very plausible theory is just bad reporting, or exaggeration. For example, there's not even a Batavia River, so it's unsure where this even took place. Plus, with it being early in the morning and a shaky boat, along with all of the excitement, they almost certainly exaggerated details. The bed troll. For this one, we have to go back in time via the web archives and visit a now defunct website, UFOfreeparanormal.com, where visitors to the site could submit their own UFO/paranormal stories. And this one comes from May 2000, when a woman named Jenna would email in with the story from her teenage years. She was 13 and shared a room with her sister, whom she had also shared a full-size bed with because her parents couldn't afford 2 beds. One night, about 11 p.m., the two had been talking about a boy they liked at school when they started to nod off. Before they completely went to sleep, though, they had heard something move across the room. It scared them and brought them back out of their near sleep-induced state. They thought it was a huge rat that was scurrying around the room, which obviously terrified them. While they sat there trying to find the source of the noise, they began to hear scratching in front of their dresser, against the wall opposite from the bed. Then it ran from the dresser to the nightstand on the side of the bed. It then paused and ran underneath it, where the two sisters could feel it moving around. This, of course, caused them to begin screaming as they held onto each other under the blankets. Right after that, this rat ran back out to the dresser, where it paused again. Then it did this whole strange set of movements about 3 or 4 times before it finally stopped moving underneath the bed. The two girls began to call for their mother, but she never came, even though her bedroom was right next to theirs. Suddenly, something began pulling on the blankets, so they pulled back and began kicking at what they thought was a rat, with her sister screaming for it to let go. Finally, he ran back over towards the dresser and then the nightstand. Jenna told her sister to see if it was gone, so she pulled the blanket back off of her head and looked to see a dark green color with huge black eyes. He was wearing a suit like a jester would wear, purple and gold in color. He laughed in her face and went right back under the bed. She tried to scream, but couldn't, but she began to cry. It then went back to the dresser and then to the middle of the floor, where both girls would look down and see it staring at them from the floor, sitting with its legs and arms crossed and head down. They covered up once more and never heard it again. The next morning, Jenna would find her favorite teddy bear was sitting in that same exact place they had seen the little being last night, which she now called a troll. She also discovered a cross necklace that her uncle had made for her was now missing. The girls, of course, told their mother and asked why she didn't help, but she said she never heard them, which was strange since she was a light sleeper. 2 days later, Jenna found the necklace in the trash, but for the strangest part, the set of movements that the troll had done in Jenna's room, well, it equaled the shape of a triangle, which would be suspicious when, a few months later, her dad's friend, who lived a mile away, died in a tractor accident. Then, a girl riding the same school bus as Jenna would end her own life, followed shortly by a friend of hers dying in a car accident, all within a few months, and all within a mile of each other. The spooky part, the houses of the deceased, if connected on a map, formed a triangle. Jenna had since wondered, was this being trying to tell her something or warn her? She finished the email by stating she never experienced anything like that again. Crazy story, but what about theories? Assuming she didn't make it up, most likely the girls really did hear and see a huge rat, and then their fear caused them to see something different, while the triangle part of the story was just her brain seeking out patterns like people tend to do. Mount Hood Sasquatch machinery. So far in this series, we have covered numerous wild theories and stories about Sasquatch, one being that the Soviets had captured a Bigfoot in 1941, while there was another one that said Bigfoot was really a hologram. But this next fringe theory might be the best yet. Sasquatch researcher Jack Lapseritis has spent many a years interviewing people who have had some kind of contact with Sasquatch, but it's one type of report he began collecting that really flips the Bigfoot world upside down. Apparently, he had spoken to many witnesses throughout the years who stated that while being out in the remote areas of the wilderness, areas known for Bigfoot sightings, they would hear a generator-like noise that seemed to sound like a machine running underground. Well, Jack wanted to know about this enigma, but it's difficult enough having a Bigfoot sighting. The chances of finding one of these subterranean Bigfoot factories would be even more difficult. So he did what any good researcher would do. He contacted a psychic. Now, Jack didn't really believe in psychics at first, but I guess he was just desperate enough to try. And once he did, he grew to trust some of them very much. And one of these would direct him to Mount Hood in Oregon. And whatever it was this psychic said, Jack must have really bought into it. And he would go to this area that he was directed, and sure enough, late that night, he began to hear machinery running underground. And it ran all night, only stopping in the early morning hours. The next day, He went exploring around his campsite and found a cave, which the psychic told him would be there. And Jack heard these strange sounds and saw some physical evidence which indicated a Sasquatch was guarding the entrance to the cave. But even though he didn't enter, he could even hear the noise of the machine running from there as well. In the years past, when Jack had collected all of these accounts, he found some of the witnesses had even made a recording of this noise, which they remarked was similar to a generator or a hydroelectric plant beneath their feet. Now, interestingly, the recordings revealed that at some point, the sound shifted, which suggested the new gears were put into motion. It wasn't just one distinct buzz all night long, which has led many Bigfoot researchers to believe that Sasquatch, at times, works as a miner. That's right. Or he, at the very least, assists miners. And why would he do this? Well, this ties back to one of the older theories we discussed previously, which suggests that aliens/UFOs have some kind of connection, and Bigfoot is collecting valuable minerals that must be vital to this extraterrestrial species. I know, I'm shocked too. As you might imagine, this theory is not widely accepted, not even by most Bigfoot researchers, and it's most likely attributed to nearby human machinery, such as generators, pumps, or logging equipment. It could even be underground springs, small hydro turbines, or pumping stations. Black streams. Chances are, most of you are familiar with the concept of dowsing. Maybe you've even seen it done. It's when someone takes a forked twig or wire, known as a dowsing rod, and uses it to detect some kind of valuable in the ground, usually water, although sometimes it can be gems or gold. It goes back to ancient times, and allegedly, about 1 in 7 people are born with the gift to use a dowser correctly. It supposedly works under the premise that the dowser plus the stick equals a biological antenna of sorts that can detect these energy fields, and at its very basic core, it's mainly linked to people who have ESP, or are telepathic. While it's largely deemed by scholars as nothing but pseudoscientific garbage, there's a long history of this practice who many swear by when it comes to looking for these positive energy fields. And since these energy fields are positive, then it stands to reason that there must be some kind of negative energy fields, right? Well, before we get started on that, it's important to point out that these energy fields, for the people that do believe in them, are usually referred to as geographic stresses, which again is looked at by mainstream science as bunk. But one of these geographic stresses is called black streams. Black streams are said to be underwater streams that emit harmful noxious radiations, or negative energy. And this negative energy, or radiation, rises to the surface of the Earth, and they are generally stronger at midday, midsummer, full moon, and solar flare activity, while they are generally weaker in winter climates, and they are also not anchored to one location, as they can be shifted due to something like an earthquake. But what causes these black streams, and how do they actually affect us? Well, black streams are caused when the Earth's etheric web, or more simply put, the hypothetical energy grid of Earth, becomes disrupted, which can happen a number of ways, like the building of railways, highways, tunnels, rock quarries, mines, foundations, power stations, military bases, or even something as simple as road signs. And it's not just buildings, it can also be any land that saw severe human suffering and trauma, like a battlefield, witch burning grounds, or even burial sites. And when it disturbs this etheric web and these black streams manifest, it causes us some nasty surprises, the most often being cancer. The first well-documented study between black streams and cancer actually dates back to the 1920s and 30s by a German dowser named Baron von Pohl, and he was asked to douse the small town of Wilsberg in 1929, which had the highest capita cancer death rate in Bavaria at that time. When going to these homes of a person that had recently died of cancer, he found that 100% of the time, these beds sat right above one of these black streams. But it's not just cancer. Other diseases have been linked as well, such as Parkinson's, or mental illness like schizophrenia, even depression, and the list goes on and on and on. And there are other effects that are non-illness, such as spots on the highway that are more accident-prone, while haunted houses and sites of poltergeist activity are also sure signs of a black stream. He also noted in his studies that most mammals seem to have an instinct to avoid these black streams, like they knew where they were located at underground and they would go at all cost to avoid the area. Now you're probably wondering how you too can avoid the area if you're not a dowser. Well, there are some obvious clues, like trees that have been struck by lightning, bare patches of lawn, mutated or stunted crops, or even the appearance of ferns and nightshades, which are attracted to black streams. But as you probably already know, none of this is believed by mainstream science. Cape Aya Metallic-Humanoid with a Sea Dragon. July 2000, Cape Aya, Crimea. A Russian family from Moscow was on vacation at a very lovely resort on the shores of the Black Sea. Little could they know that this relaxing time would soon turn into one of the most bizarre experiences they would ever have. The father, who chose to remain anonymous, was using his binoculars to stare out into the sea, when all of a sudden, something caught his eye in the water. It was some kind of humanoid entity swimming around. He claimed he knew it wasn't human, nor the common diver, because this thing was about 9.5 feet tall. But even stranger, it was wearing some kind of tight-fitting shiny metallic suit. And if you think that's strange, you haven't heard anything yet, because this weird humanoid seemed to be playing around in the water with a huge light brown snake-like creature, something that resembled a sea dragon, which swam nearby the man. The two continued to stay close to each other. Soon, more witnesses spotted it and ran close to the water, where they all took in the scene for about 15 minutes, at which time the sea snake swam further up the coast, only to be followed by the humanoid. The crowd of onlookers watched for about 10 minutes until it vanished behind some coastal shrubbery. This story, as crazy as it sounds, was first documented by a legit oceanographer, Anatoly Tavarchesky, and although he is a legit oceanographer, I have to point out, the same man has claimed to have discovered an underwater city, and he's had a lifelong pursuit of a cryptid known as the Karadag Serpent. Regardless, his account was picked up and printed in various articles by a Russian UFO researcher, Anton Amphilov, and it's Anton that has went on to document numerous other reports of this sea dragon that is often seen near the Crimean coast. But the question is, what exactly are people seeing? Well, considering the waters here are home to coastal dolphins and porpoises, along with other large marine animals, it's most likely just that. The conger eel in particular looks very snake-like, not to mention there are very large sturgeon in the area. It could also just be an optical error caused by looking through the binoculars. Or hey, maybe it really is a sea serpent. Annapolis Monster Shark. 1987, a journalist named John Mellon, writing for the Annapolis Capital, located in Maryland, was going through old accounts and archives looking for something interesting to write about for the upcoming June Week. June Week, if you're not familiar, is when students graduate from the Annapolis Naval Academy, and is famous in the area for its week-long celebration that encompasses most of the city, which of course brings us back to John. He wanted to find something in the newspaper archives to write about for the upcoming celebration that week, and what he found was actually one of the more plausible and scary cryptid stories that we have ever covered, because John would come across an article penned in the 1930s by a man named Reverend James L. Smiley. In that article, he would recall of a year where the celebration of June Week took a back seat to much larger news. The year, though, is uncertain, although it had to be after 1871, and Reverend Smiley would record that as war vessels came into the Chesapeake Bay en route to Annapolis roads, the men aboard the crafts would spot something unbelievable: a monstrous great white shark about 40 feet long. For context, most great whites are 11 to 16 feet in length, while the biggest on record is 20 feet, meaning what these sailors seen was double the size of the biggest on record. Even at a time when news traveled slowly, the story got around quick, and soon, local conjecture was that this shark had migrated north and was on a bit of a sightseeing tour, or perhaps more likely, a feeding tour. But it wasn't just this one sighting, because reports kept coming in further and further north as it appeared to be getting closer to Annapolis. Because of the size of this beast, as well as the reputation of the witnesses, authorities took as much action as they could, and they put out warnings for small crafts to just stay home, not to be out in the water, or at the very least, not out too far. This suggests that they took this very seriously, as they believed it was a dangerous situation. But the warning had the reverse effect, because soon, tourist boat companies began to sell out their rentals to anyone wanting to find this gigantic shark. And what Reverend Smiley recorded next was absolutely awful, because to attract this shark, locals rounded up stray dogs, took them aboard, and threw them in the water to try and entice this beast to surface and devour the dog. It was barbaric, and Smiley would record the numerous strays would be eaten by other sharks, but never the huge white shark they were all looking for. But it got even worse, because soon, dog hunting even became a thing, with $5 for any stray dog that could be brought to the docks to be used as bait. It's not hard to imagine that many loving dog owners had their pets stolen during all this. And if you're thinking this is just a time period thing, and that these people didn't care about dogs like people nowadays do, well, that's not correct, because this upset a lot of people in the area, and they put pressure on authorities to stop the practice immediately. Soon the whole thing died down, as there were no reported giant shark sightings anyways. But what to make about this immense beast? Well, it really all depends on Reverend Smiley's account itself. Was he a reputable person? That is the question to this perplexing mystery, because if real, it is no doubt the largest great white shark ever recorded, and could potentially point to other sea life that may be way bigger than we originally thought. But to get to that answer, we have to go to where this account was found. And it wasn't actually in a newspaper. It was actually discovered in a book that belonged to the Maryland Anti-Vivisection Society. What is that, you might ask? Think of it this way. It was like the early 20th century version of PETA, except maybe a little more extreme. And here is a book produced by them, featuring this account by Reverend Smiley. And although there is no record that shows that Smiley was even associated with the group, well, there were a lot of other members of the clergy that did become members. So it's not a stretch to believe that Reverend Smiley was also a member. And since he didn't actually give a date of when this occurred, other than saying sometime after 1871, and considering there's no other real records of this event playing out, could Reverend Smiley have made the whole thing up? Maybe as a propaganda piece to recruit more people into the Anti-Vivisection Society. Or if it did happen, maybe he exaggerated some of the details, like the whole dog thing, or the real size of the shark that was sighted. Phantom Blimp Crash, 1931. October 10th, 1931, a man named Harold Mackenzie of Gallipolis, Ohio, was standing on the riverbank when he would peer up into the sky and see something he was not accustomed to. There far above was a mysterious airship. Now I have to point out here, before we go any further, unlike other stories we have covered in the past, by this point in time, airships were indeed a very real thing, and not just a concept. And while Harold knew exactly what it was he was looking at, it didn't make sense that it was out here in the middle of Appalachia, just coasting around in the sky. He quickly rushed to town and stopped by a local dairy plant where he told his friends to go out and look. Soon enough, these friends, Robert Henke and his wife, along with Dr. Claude Parker and his wife, would go out to First Avenue and share binoculars as they watched the craft go over the sky. This unsurprisingly drew the attention of local residents in the small town, who all came out to watch. They estimated that it was about 100 to 150 feet long and about 300 feet high. Here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. Soon the neighbor town of Point Pleasant, yep, the same Point Pleasant that Mothman would be a fixture of 30 years later, would also have residents who seen the blimp. In fact, it was workers along the state highway that would see it first. Then, people at Raccoon Island, before it went over into Huntington, West Virginia. But this is when it would get really crazy, because at 2:50 p.m., the witnesses who would never dreamed of seeing a blimp over Appalachia would be shocked when they seen the airship begin to buckle and break apart into two pieces. Smoke filled the air as the ship crashed down the hills near Gallipolis Ferry, and that's when several of the witnesses saw 4 people in parachutes jumping off the side to save their lives. The witnesses, of course, contacted the owner of the nearby Gallipolis Airport, owned by Dr. Charles E. Hoser. It was also just 10 minutes after the reported crash that a Lieutenant D. Eckford Hodgson employed at the airway, was checking out plane engines when one witness drove up and asked him if he had seen the blimp overhead. Although Eckford had not seen it, the witness described it as not having any markings or a cabin, and that it stayed in the same location for about an hour before the crash. At this point, Sheriff H.E. Burdett would launch a search immediately. They made it to the wooded area by midnight, but by dawn, they had found nothing. Meanwhile, the state troopers launched a ground search of their own, while airplanes flew over the general area of the crash, looking for any sign of debris or survivors, but found nothing. After a day of searching and not finding anything, search and rescue gave up until they could find who the craft belonged to and what direction they were going. That's when they found out that all of the blimps were accounted for, and none of the debris, wreckage, or remains have ever been found. Yet, there were over 30 witnesses who reported it to the police. So, what did they see? Well, it's very plausible they really did see an airship, but it's very doubtful that it crashed and was never recovered. That was either added in or they saw some kind of illusion created by weather. But then again, considering the time frame, it's just as likely the whole story was a hoax. Alright guys, it's time for a little bit of small mystery roundup. You know how it goes. These are the mysteries where there's not a lot of data, or just not very interesting. We start out with one called Laundry Sink Cans. For this one, we have to go back to the web archives and visit a site known as UFOfreeparanormal.com, where visitors to the site could submit their own UFO paranormal stories. The following came from a man named Barney Woodard, who emailed on June 21st, 2008, and told a very bizarre story. According to Barney, when he was a small child, about 4 to 5 years old, he was in the basement in the laundry room with his mom, who was doing laundry. While leaning on a deep washroom sink, he would look down curiously to see a green hand coming from the drain. It had long fingernails and moved its fingers all around the basin. He screamed, of course, but when his mom looked, it had already disappeared. Fast forward a few years, and he was at a family reunion, and everyone was standing around talking about weird things that had happened to them over the years, and his nephew would begin to tell a story of a day he had seen a green hand in a laundry tub sink when he was a little boy. When asked for more details about the event, he stated he did not desire to go into any more details about it, but a few minutes later he did say, "One thing I do remember was that had," and right at the same time, Barney chimed in and said, "Long fingernails?" His nephew never elaborated anymore, but Barney emailed in asking if anyone else had heard of a similar sighting. So what to make of it? Assuming he didn't make the story up, this is one of the easier theories actually. Kids' visual systems and imaginations work differently than adults, and what Barney likely seen was just a rag, a drain cover, or a pattern of grime he thought was a hand. Leaning over a deep sink at that vantage point messed with his perception, and over the years, it's likely that his memory distorted it even more. Sunspot activity with historical warfare. We have discussed the moon's effect on people's psychological states, so it stands to reason that there are a group of people who also believe the sun influences our mood, more specifically, sunspot activity. And it's not that it just affects one or two people. This fringe theory states that mankind as a whole is impacted. But before we delve into this theory, let's take a look at sunspot activity to get a better understanding. Sunspots are dark, cooler areas on the sun's surface caused by magnetic field disturbances, resulting in a temperature that is about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, which can result in more solar flares and higher overall radiation output. They were first documented by telescope in 1610 by Galileo and a few others, and over the time spent studying them since, we have come to learn that the number of sunspots rise and fall on a predictable pattern. For example, every 27 days we see a short-term cycle of solar activity, while every 11 years we see a longer magnetic cycle, and finally, one more at around 90 years. And scientists speculate there could be even longer patterns of time we just haven't observed yet. Now that we have explained that, let's take a closer look at the theory itself, which basically states during these longer patterns of solar activity, like the one that occurs every 11 years, there is an uptick in warfare, with several examples: the American Revolution, French Revolution, War of 1812, the American Civil War, Russian Revolution, World War I, Hungarian Uprising, end of communism, and 9/11 all occurred during these times of high solar activity. There's even some data that shows the U.S. interventions into the Middle East all occurred at these times as well. But as mentioned, it's more of a fringe theory than anything else. But if you're curious, we entered the last cycle in 2023, so there's that. Kriegerstown Jabberwocks. Many of you, I'm sure, remember the story of Alice in Wonderland, but I wonder if you remember the creature, Jabberwock, the terrifying large dragon-like beast. It's okay if you don't remember it, because the real mystery here is the cryptid that would take the name later on. 1890, Kriegerstown, Maryland. A mysterious creature was spotted, which was described as being lizard-headed, humpbacked, long-tailed, and web-footed. After some locals were made aware of its presence, they began to look for the creature by following the tracks that it had left, and they apparently followed it from Kriegerstown to Grayson and then Thurmont, about a 5-mile trail in total. This led to the creature earning the moniker in the local papers, Jabberwock, probably because Alice in Wonderland was still fresh on the minds of people. Now there are several strange things about this account, which we have very limited info on. First of all, this allegedly happened in 1890, but the article that actually tells us the story came out on December 1st, 1932 in the Frederick News. But making it even weirder was this article was reprinted in the 4th issue of the Bigfoot Abstract that came out in July 1988, which suggests they at least thought it was Bigfoot related. I tried to find more appearances of this cryptid, and there are a few reports between the 1870s and 1890s, but all of the descriptions vary. And just like the other, the articles are printed decades after the event, but we'll stick to the one seen by numerous people in Kriegerstown, and most likely, what they really seen was a river otter. The lizard head fits the elongated snout, along with the web-footed tracks and long tail. The inorganic evolves via our tool use. This is another fringe theory that basically suggests that inorganic matter evolves via our tool use. For example, mankind develops a flint hammer. This allows for more precise shaping of materials, but it also creates a feedback loop because now we can make more complex tools. So now these complex tools are eventually made, and mankind's brain gets a little bit smarter and sees new challenges and makes more complex tools, which then makes mankind's brain smarter, and on, and on, and on. You get it. It's supposed to show the relationship between us and inorganic matter is symbiotic. So in summary, we act as an evolutionary driver for inorganic matter, and it does the same for us. Ancient skyscrapers. Okay, how about a trivia question now? What year did the first official skyscraper finish construction? Give up? Well, it's sort of a trick question, because it depends on what you consider a skyscraper to be. Some claim the Equitable Life Building, constructed in 1870, was, all because it was the first tall office building to have an elevator. However, it's the Home Insurance Building of Chicago, constructed in 1885, that most scholars point to as the first true modern skyscraper. And I use that word modern because it's key to this conspiracy, which states that ancient skyscrapers existed as well. Now, if you're a history buff, or even do a cursory Google search, you'll quickly find a city called Shibam, located in Yemen. It's famous for its mud brick made high-rise buildings, which see some of them stretch as high as 11 stories. And the interesting part was it was built all the way back into the 3rd century AD and has been inhabited ever since. Logically, just looking at these buildings, many have made the argument that these were the first true skyscrapers in history, which means the conspiracy is true, right? Well, not exactly, because our conspiracy specifically states that skyscrapers in the modern sense as we know them existed back then too. This one, I couldn't find much about, and it seems to be more of a joke conspiracy than a real one, because although there were huge structures back in ancient times, none of them are similar or as tall as modern skyscrapers. And that's it for this edition of the Small Mystery Roundup. But before we get back to the video, if you like the content and would like to help support the channel, take a look at the YouTube membership or Patreon link in the description below. Now, let's get back to it. Aintree Spectres. It was an early autumn night in 1967 or 68 when a young man in his late teens, going by the pseudonym Jeffrey of Aintree, Lancashire, England, was walking back to his family home. He had actually missed the bus earlier in the evening, leading to this predicament of having to walk, but at least with the moon out, it was a clear night. Unfortunately, as it got later, around 11 p.m., his vision was dampened by the darkness, since at this time, there had been no street lighting installed on this back road. That would only serve to terrify Jeff more, because as he was walking along, he noticed something to his right. It was lights, about 150 yards away in a field. He stopped and counted. It was 9 men carrying torches, walking along the riverbank, heading away from him. He noticed they were wearing grayish robes with pointed hoods similar to those worn by the KKK. They were marching in line like soldiers. Obviously, this would terrify anyone, and Jeff took off running back home and immediately got his father out of bed. They went to a window on the upstairs floor and peered out and could still see the torch-lit procession moving on. Not knowing what to do, his father would go back to bed. Jeff, meanwhile, decided to sleep on his parents' bedroom floor due to his fear. This would be the first sighting of the beings known as the Aintree Spectres, because a few years later, sometime in the early 1970s, Jeff's parents were driving home after his father had picked his mom up from bingo. As they passed that same exact field that Jeff had seen the specters in years ago, his parents would see a dozen or so men holding torches and wearing robes, and some with pointed hoods. They were standing in a circle, like they were involved in some kind of seance. The parents did not stop, obviously, but he did remark that when they got home, it would have been impossible for other people to have not seen them. Yet, that seemed to be the case. As the family asked neighbors over the next few days about the strange gathering of these hooded individuals, no one had any idea what they were talking about. This would stay that way for a bit, until one of the friends of Jeff's father, Glenn, would actually bring up the strange sighting unprompted to him one day. That would be it, though, for the next decade. Soon the whole event was forgotten about, and it wouldn't be until the late 80s, when Glenn was chatting with an old friend, that the conversation turned to the supernatural, and Glenn started telling his story about these hooded individuals, and before he could even finish, this friend interrupted him and told him about the same encounter he had, although he had witnessed it way back in World War II, when the countryside was under blackout procedure. Now, I can't go into every one of these sightings, simply because of the time it would take, but after this story was printed in the local newspaper, it was a little bit of a surprise that some people wrote in to say they too experienced the same phenomenon, always in the same field, although sometimes the people carried no torches or lights at all. It is worth noting that many other residents were interviewed for this article, and none of them had ever seen any robed individuals at night. But if this witness testimony is accurate, what are people seeing? Most likely, it's nothing more than a prank. Maybe local teens or college kids masquerading as ghosts. The first appearance in the late 60s at least, and every sighting since has been other kids trying to keep the folktale going. Of course, there's also the possibility that it could have been some kind of secret religious group, as the newspaper found at least one person who stated he knew of a tight group of Christian fundamentalists that would do these torchlight meetings, although this refers to the sightings of the 80s, which doesn't explain the earlier ones. Then again, maybe it really was ghosts. Cop killer of Harbin City. June 6, 1987. 36-year-old police officer Zhang Fugi of Harbin, China, laid down to bed that night along with his wife and 3 children, never expecting that once he fell asleep, he would enter a nightmare, because as the family drifted off, an unknown intruder would break into their home, and with a knife or hatchet, depending on the source, would kill Zhang, his wife, his son, and daughter. Zhang was found with 17 wounds to his chest, abdomen, and arms that came from fighting back. His wife, Ming, a school teacher and restaurant owner, suffered similar wounds. The 10-year-old daughter was almost decapitated, while their 5-year-old son died from a single wound. The unknown assailant would then attack the other daughter, 7-year-old Zhang Guzhu, who suffered 3 wounds before running to her neighbor's home as the suspect fled. She amazingly survived. The home had been ransacked of various things, but a lot of the valuables, such as money, clothing, and camera, were untouched. Zhang's service pistol, bullets, and holster were swiped though. The family shed was also broken into, and a single footprint was left behind. Investigators began to look into the background of Zhang, but could not find anyone who would want to harm him. The investigation kept focusing on the brutality of the murder and believed it had happened out of revenge or hatred, but again, no suspects emerged. So they would go through recent arrest records to see who all Jong had taken into custody, particularly any of the ones where Jong would have had to use force, or in any case where he went to break up a dispute and one of the parties went away unhappy. They found one early lead, that of a 27-year-old thief who had been violently detained by Jong in the past. His name was Lee Sanwei. However, he could not be found at the time. It would take 3 months to haul him in, where he was interrogated and admitted he wanted to kill Jong, but never did. Police thought they had their man, but could not find the weapons. However, they decided it was a matter of time before they had their proof, so they held him while they began putting their case together. But that strategy would come undone when on the night of October 12th, He Ruichin, the head of the police station in Wandatown, was lying restless and decided to go outside for a walk. Suddenly, his wife, daughter, and neighbors all heard gunshots. Now at first, they weren't really alarmed, because Ruichin had a reputation for being a hothead and would often fire warning shots into the air if someone trespassed across his yard. But as time wore on, and he didn't go back inside the home, his family would go outside to see him laying in a pool of his own blood. He was actually still alive, and told his wife someone beat him with a gun, and then he passed out. In total, he had been shot once and stabbed 4 times. A neighbor named Zhou Xiaoshen would see what was going on and rushed out to help. He brought Ruichin inside and tried to call the police, but a masked man came out from behind a shed opening and fired on Zhou, hitting him, which ended the phone call obviously. Another neighbor charged the gunman, and he aimed the gun and pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed. This neighbor was then able to pick up a blunt object and hit the gunman, causing him to drop the gun and flee. Both Ruichin and the neighbor Zhou passed away before the EMS arrived. After this, the town was put on lockdown. An investigation began the next morning, and footprints and fingerprints were found, and the gun and bullets, unsurprisingly, were the same stolen from Zhang Fugi. Luckily though, there were survivors to give a description, but unluckily, he had most of his face covered except for the eyes. He was about 5'8", and from what witnesses could see, he had pimples on his face, and the mask was black or a dark shade of some other color. Obviously, police knew that this was the same man that murdered the first police officer, and they could now safely dismiss their first suspect, who they were still holding. Police had little to go on, but a couple of weeks later, they did find the clothing, shoes, and holster, all used by the killer, which had been discarded in the river. They were in a very easy to spot location, as he had made no real attempt to hide them. But, with nothing else to go on, the police decided to put together a criminal profile. They knew he was around 5'8" and believed he was between 25 and 35 years old. He was skilled with firearms, and most likely had a history of using them. He also probably worked with diesel or engine oil, which they based on the traces and smell found on the clothing. But the investigation stalled, which would have dire consequences, because the maniac hit just a few weeks later, on October 28th, 7 a.m., when the police were called to the home of the deputy director of the Hulun County Police Security Bureau, Ma Fulin. When they arrived, they had found he had suffered 3 wounds to the head and was covered in blood. His 20-year-old son-in-law, Ma Shoke, had several wounds across his body, deep enough to expose bone, while his wife was found leaning against a wall and was decapitated. Fulin had been attacked while sleeping, while his wife and son-in-law woke up and did not have time to react. Now this next part is important, because the perp had actually intentionally destroyed the crime scene by releasing the family's geese into the room, and some sources also cite that he had opened a water tap flooding the room. Then to make matters worse, curious onlookers had arrived and contaminated the area. Detectives determined the man had came over a wall in the yard and knocked down the locked door, which was pretty weak anyways. He had likely used a hatchet or axe. Again, the officer's pistol and bullets were stolen. They also found that not too long before this, he had 2 bicycles stolen from him, and now investigators believe this killer was using that bicycle to flee the crime scenes. A search was on for it, and it was eventually found about 4 miles away from the crime scene, where again, fingerprints were taken. Police in response took fingerprints of people in the area, actually a really wide area. Even officers were checked, but again, there were no matches. The situation was so bad now, the police were told not to wear their uniforms in public, and a curfew was put into place, with no one allowed to be out after dark. other than the police. Many officers just straight up quit the force in response to the danger. However, some officers refused to be intimidated. One of these was a 33-year-old, Charles Hyde, and on the night of December 27th, he would boldly wear his uniform in public as he went to the home of the deputy director, Dong Cha, to give an update on the murder spree. As he was one of the main investigators, Zhu arrived at 5:20 p.m. and began to walk to the door, and as he passed a wall in the courtyard, a man fired a shot at him, hitting him in the waist. He screamed and instinctively went for his gun before he was shot again in the abdomen, and he fell to the ground. His screams, along with the gunshots, woke the deputy director's son, who looked out to see Zhu's body was on the snow-covered ground. He would call the police, and then, with a neighbor, bandaged him up until an ambulance arrived. He was taken to the hospital, where he later died, and again, the bullets matched the one stolen from the previous murder of Ma Fulin. Now that an officer was murdered right in front of the deputy director's home, the town was placed under martial law. Roadblocks were everywhere, and the police walked up and down the streets while sniffer dogs were deployed. But still, nothing was found. Investigators did have one theory about this last murder, though. They believed that since Zhu was a rookie cop, he was not likely the target. Instead, since the murder took place at the deputy director's home, a man with decades worth of time on the force, he was the real target, and Zhu was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The police, now in response to the last murder and witness account, redid their profile to cite that the man was 35 to 50 years old because of the level of experience and expertise he had. Now, we fast forward a month and a half to February 15th, 1988, when a 30-year-old bailiff, Liu Yongji, was washing his clothes. While his daughter was watching TV in the living room, he would go outside to dump the dirty water when he felt a sharp pain and turned around to see a man dressed in black and hiding his face, stabbing him in the shoulder. Liu began to wrestle the attacker and was doing well, holding his ground. He was a former soldier and was still in good shape, but his attacker was just as strong and gained the upper hand. He would stab him again, but luckily, he was wearing his police trousers and holster and reached for his gun. But the killer seen it and brandished his own and then shot Liu twice, once missing, the other hitting a non-vital area, while Liu's shots missed completely and the perp fled. Because they were in a rural area, neighbors had to go about 10 minutes away to the nearest payphone to call the police. Again, sniffer dogs were brought in, and they lost the scent. This time, the officer thankfully survived, and the bullets were obviously matched to Ma Fulin's gun. This was the first time, however, that a police officer wasn't targeted. Now detectives had to widen their scope to include court officials, soldiers, prison guards, and security guards. In fact, another prison guard would have his home broken into after this, only to see the murderer flee after realizing the guard was waiting on him. This too was connected to the unsolved murders. The killer was never captured, however, and that might be because he was very careful to never leave any traces, and the fingerprints he did leave could never be linked to anybody, as they were not on record. He also carefully planned out his crimes and was familiar with the victims and locations of all the murders. He also made sure to keep his face hidden too. And finally, he intentionally contaminated many of the crime scenes, making it difficult to find evidence. As far as theories go, obviously investigators believe he had a strong hatred towards authority due to the brutality of his crimes, so they reasoned that he may have been an ex-con who served time in prison before. Others think, however, he was actually linked to or paid by an organized criminal syndicate to carry out the hits, while others think he was a disgruntled police officer himself, seeking revenge against co-workers, or possibly just making a statement. There was even some speculation that he was a retired police officer with a grudge. It may even be why they changed the age range all the way up to the mid-50s. However, detectives that were on the case at the time, and now are retired, have recently spoken about the case in interviews, and one of these confessed that the simple truth was they had nothing. No forensics, no surveillance footage, no leads. It was like they were chasing a ghost. But another question remains. What made the man stop killing? Was he jailed for something else? Or did he die? Or did he simply walk away after almost being caught breaking into the correction officer's home? No one is sure, but if he is still alive, he would be in his early 70s by now.